My father left my brother the family business, my sister house, and me just a cardboard box of junk. You know how they say home is where the heart is? Well, mine was parked in a beat-up 1978 Fleetwood trailer sitting behind my dad's auto shop in Millfield, Ohio. Population 3,847. On a good day, when the college kids weren't home for summer break. That trailer wasn't just some piece of aluminum junk, though. It was my grandfather's legacy, passed down to me when I turned 18 like some kind of weird inheritance. Most kids get college funds or fancy watches. I got a mobile home that hadn't moved an inch in 20 years. But man, that little tin can hold more memories than a photo album. The smell of worn leather from Grandpa's old recliner still lingered in the corners. That faded brown carpet where we used to play poker while Johnny Cash crooned about Folsom Prison blues from his ancient turntable. The kitchen table where he taught me how to hold a wrench properly, oil-stained fingers guiding mine as we fixed broken radios together. Life was different back then. Simpler, maybe. Grandpa used to say that life was like a record player. Sometimes the needle gets stuck, but you can always lift it up and start the song over again. The auto shop was supposed to be my future. Dad made that crystal clear from the day I graduated high school with grades that wouldn't get me into community college. He'd slap my back with those grease-stained hands and promise me the world wrapped up in chrome bumpers and engine blocks. "This is your inheritance, son," he'd tell me while we worked on Mrs. Henderson's busted Camry. "All of this will be yours someday." I believed him. 6 years of believing every single word. Working for peanuts didn't bother me at first. Minimum wage plus tips from grateful customers who didn't want to drive 30 miles to the nearest dealership. I figured I was paying my dues, learning the trade, building something that would actually last. The American dream wrapped up in motor oil and honest sweat. But Dad changed after Mom passed 3 years back. The sickness took her fast, and it took something out of him too. Started drinking more, talking less, looking at me like I reminded him of something he'd rather forget. The fight happened on a Tuesday in September. I remember because we just finished working on the Patterson family's minivan, and business was actually good for once. Good enough that I thought maybe it was time to make things official. So I asked him straight up, when were we going to put my name on the paperwork? Make me a real partner instead of just a guy who did all the heavy lifting for pocket change? His face went red as a brake light. Started yelling about ungrateful kids who thought they could just demand half of everything he'd built from nothing. That wasn't what I meant, and he knew it. I just wanted something on paper that said I mattered, that all those years of busted knuckles and 12-hour days added up to more than a paycheck that barely covered my grocery bill. We didn't speak for the last month of his life. 31 days of working side by side in complete silence, passing tools like strangers. Heart attack took him on a Thursday morning while he was replacing brake pads on old Mrs. Patterson's Honda. Found him face down under the hood, wrench still in his hand. My brother Jake flew in from Denver for the services. Sister Sarah drove up from Columbus with her husband and their twin boys. We hadn't all been in the same room since Mom's funeral, and now it took Dad's to make it happen again. The lawyer's office smelled like stale coffee and old regrets. Mr. Peterson had handled Dad's affairs for 20 years, watching him build a business from a 2-bay operation into something that actually turned a profit. Sarah sat to my left, checking her phone every 30 seconds. Jake slouched in his chair at my right, already complaining about missing work. Neither of them had set foot in that shop since high school. Neither of them knew how to tell a carburetor from a catalytic converter. Peterson cleared his throat and started reading. The house on Maple Street went to Sarah. Made sense, she had kids. The savings account got split between her and Jake for their children's education. Then came the shop. My shop. The place where I'd spent 6 years of my life. To my son, Jacob, I leave Millfield Auto Repair, including all tools, equipment, and property, to do with as he sees fit. The words hit me like a sledgehammer. Jake actually looked surprised, which made it worse. At least if he'd been expecting it. I could have hated him properly. And to Charles, I leave the contents of one cardboard box, labeled Charlie Stuff, currently stored in the office filing cabinet. A cardboard box. 6 years of honest work, and I got a cardboard box. Later, Sarah pulled me aside and whispered what I'd already figured out. Dad never got over that fight we had. Never forgave me for bringing up the whole partnership thing. Guess he thought I was trying to take something that wasn't mine, when all I wanted was to belong somewhere. The box was waiting for me back at the shop, sitting on Dad's desk like some kind of cruel punchline. Brown cardboard, about the size of a shoebox, with Charlie's stuff written in Dad's chicken scratch handwriting. Inside were things I'd forgotten I'd lost. My high school graduation photo, a pocket knife Grandpa had given me, and a bunch of old vinyl records I thought had disappeared years ago. After Grandpa died, Dad had cleaned out the trailer and packed away everything that reminded him of the old man. I'd assumed my childhood memories had gone to the dump along with everything else. Johnny Cash stared up at me from the cover of At Folsom Prison. Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited sat underneath, followed by Hank Williams, Patsy Cline, and a dozen other voices from before I was born. Jake wandered over while I was going to box, probably feeling guilty enough to pretend he cared. He looked at the records and actually laughed. What are you going to do with those old things? Start a cover band? Call yourself the Vinyl Losers or something? That's when I knew for sure that he didn't get it. These weren't just old records. They were pieces of a man who taught me that work meant something, that fixing broken things was a kind of art. I was about to close the box when I noticed something weird. The Johnny Cash album felt too thick, like there was something extra inside the sleeve. My hand was shaking a little as I slid the record out and found a sealed envelope tucked behind it. The envelope was yellowed with age, and my name was written across the front in handwriting I recognized but hadn't seen in years. Grandpa's careful script, each letter formed like it mattered. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice, covered in that same careful handwriting. The day at the top made my heart skip. It was written just a week before Grandpa died, 30 years ago. Charlie, it began, I'm writing this knowing my time is running short. The doctors gave me their timeline, but I got something more important to worry about. Making sure you get what's truly yours. Your father is a good man, but we see the world differently. I have a feeling he'll forget what really matters when I'm gone. My hands were trembling as I read his words. It was like he was sitting right there in that office with me. Oil-stained fingers pointed to each line as he spoke. Your father meant well, but somewhere along the way, he mistook ownership for legacy. He forgot that what you build isn't measured by what you keep, but by what you pass on. I tried to show him that the old ways weren't always worse than the new ones, but some lessons can't be forced on a man who's already made up his mind. The letter went on, talking about how he'd watched me work on those old radios, how I had hands that understood broken things and a heart that wanted to fix them. He wrote about music and memory and how the two were connected in ways that most people never figured out. But it was the last paragraph that made everything else disappear. I've left something for you, Charlie, something your father doesn't know about and never will. It's not much by most people's standards, but it might be everything by yours. Remember that old storage place out on Route 9, where we used to drive past on our way to get ice cream? That's where dreams go to wait for the right person to wake them up. Look for the unit that matches the day you came into this world. And remember that sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in dust and years of patience. The letter was signed simply Grandpa Joe, followed by one last line that made my chest tighten up. If you're holding this letter, Charlie, then you're already halfway home to yourself. I sat there in that quiet office for I don't know how long, holding a message from a dead man who somehow knew exactly what I'd need to hear. Route 9 Storage Facility. October 4th, my birthday. Unit number 204, maybe? Jake had left without saying goodbye. Sarah was probably halfway back to Columbus by now, and I was sitting there with a cardboard box full of old records and the first real hope I'd felt in months. Grandpa always did like his puzzles. Used to hide Easter eggs year-round just to watch me hunt for them, leaving clues that made me think harder than any teacher ever did. This felt like his biggest puzzle yet. Outside, the Ohio sky was doing the thing it does in late fall, painting everything gray and promising rain that might turn to snow before morning. The trailer was waiting for me, same as always, but somehow it felt different now. Not like a prison, like a launching pad. I locked up the shop, Jake's shop now, I guess, and walked across the gravel lot to my little aluminum home. The Johnny Cash record was still in my hands, and I could almost hear Grandpa's voice humming along to Ring of Fire, while his arthritic fingers worked over the guts of another broken radio. Sometimes the needle gets stuck, I whispered to the empty air, but you can always start the song over again. That night, I sat in Grandpa's old recliner with the letters spread across my lap, planning my trip to Route 9. The storage facility was about 40 minutes from Millfield, right where Grandpa said it would be. We used to drive past it every Sunday on our way to Dairy Queen, and he'd always point out like it was some kind of landmark. Funny how the important places in your life sometimes hide in plain sight for years before you realize what they mean. I must have read that letter 50 times before I finally fell asleep in the chair, dreaming of dusty storage units and hidden treasures, an old man's laugh echoing through the years like a song that never really ends. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was streaming to the trailer's little windows, turning the dust motes into tiny dancers. The letter was still there, real as the coffee cup I'd forgotten to wash and the oil stain on my work shirt that would never come out. Somewhere out on Route 9 was the rest of my story. Grandpa had made sure of that. All I had to do was follow the music. The drive to Route 9 felt like the longest 40 minutes of my life. Every mile marker made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter, like I was heading toward either the biggest disappointment or the biggest discovery of my 24 years. Bridgeport Self-Storage looked exactly like every other storage facility in Ohio. Rows of orange metal doors stretching out like some kind of suburban maze. The kind of place where people store Christmas decorations, old furniture, and apparently decades-old family secrets. I sat in my truck for a good 10 minutes, just staring at the main office. Part of me wanted to turn around and drive home, pretend I'd never found that letter. At least then I could keep believing that maybe, somewhere out there, somebody had actually planned something good for me. But the other part of me, the part that sounded a lot like Grandpa Joe, kept whispering that some doors are meant to be open, even when you're scared of what's behind them. The woman at the front desk looked like she'd been working there since the Carter administration. Gray hair pulled back tight, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, and the kind of tired expression that comes from dealing with people's storage drama all day long. I gave her my name and asked about Unit 204. She typed something into her computer that looked older than my truck, then squinted at the screen like she was trying to decipher hieroglyphics. "Well, I'll be," she muttered. "That unit's been paid up automatically for 24 years. Some old bank account that just finally got closed last month." My heart started beating faster. 24 years. That would put it right around when I was born, when Grandpa was still alive but already planning ahead. "We figure whoever set up the payment wanted to make sure this thing stayed put for a long time," she continued, handing me a clipboard with about 50 forms to fill out. "It's rare, but not unheard of. He must have planned this out real careful. Good thing you showed up when you did, though. We were planning an auction off the contents next month." The paperwork took forever, but eventually she handed me a key that felt heavier than it should have. Unit 204 was in the back row, past all the newer climate control spaces, in the section where the older storage units sat baking in the Ohio sun. The lock on the door was old and stubborn, like it hadn't been opened in years. When it finally clicked and I rolled up that metal door, the smell hit me first, dust and old wood, and something else I couldn't quite place. Something that reminded me of Grandpa's workshop. The unit was small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, and mostly empty except for a single wooden chest sitting in the center, like it was waiting for me. I dragged the chest out into the sunlight and popped the latches. Inside was a treasure trove of stuff I'd never seen before. Rolled up papers that looked like blueprints, small hand tools I didn't recognize, and a thick leather journal wrapped in what looked like an old shop rag. The blueprints were the first thing that caught my attention. They were drawn by hand, every line precise and deliberate, showing some kind of mechanical device that looked part jukebox, part player piano, and part something from a mad scientist's dream. At the top of each page, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting, were the words Heritage Music Box, Patent Application 1971. Below that was a detailed drawing of what could only be described as the most beautiful music machine I'd ever seen. All curves and brass fittings, with intricate gears and mechanisms that seemed to dance across the page. But it was the journal that really got to me. Every page was filled with Grandpa's thoughts, sketches, and dreams about this machine he'd apparently been designing for years. Music isn't just sound, he'd written on one page. It's the space between the notes where memory lives. It's the feeling you get when a song ends, but somehow keeps playing in your heart. I sat there in that storage unit, reading page after page of a man's passion project that nobody else had ever seen. He wrote about wanting to create something that could capture the soul of music, not just the mechanics of it. Something that would make people remember what it felt like to really listen. There were sketches of gear ratios and spring mechanisms, notes about different types of wood and their acoustic properties, and calculations that made my high school math look like finger painting. But scattered throughout all the technical stuff were these philosophical observations that hit me right in the chest. A song is just air moving until someone gives it meaning, he'd written. But meaning is what separates a machine from magic. The patent paperwork was all there too, officially filed with the U.S. Patent Office in 1971. The application had been approved, which meant Grandpa actually owned the rights to this design. Whatever this thing was supposed to be, it was legally his creation. But what really made my hands shake was a letter tucked into the back of the journal, written in the same ink as everything else but clearly added later. It was addressed to me, just like the one I found in the record sleeve. Charlie, it began, if you've made it this far, then you're braver than I was at your age. I spent 40 years thinking about this machine, drawing it, refining it, but I never had the courage to actually build it. Your father thought it was a waste of time, said people wanted new music, not old machines. Maybe he was right, but maybe there's room in this world for both. The letter went on to explain that he'd tried to interest some manufacturers in the design back in the 70s, but everyone said it was too complicated, too expensive, too old-fashioned for modern times. But I kept thinking, he continued, that someday someone would understand what I was trying to create. Someone who knew that the best things in life aren't always the newest or the fastest or the cheapest. Someone who understood that there's magic in making something with your hands that brings joy to other people. At the bottom of the page, he'd written something that made me laugh and cry at the same time. My son forgot what it means to build something that lasts. But you, Charlie, you'll remind the world that some things are worth the extra effort. I must have sat in that storage unit for 2 hours, going through every page of that journal twice. By the time I finally loaded everything into my truck, the sun was starting to set, and I had more questions than answers. The drive home gave me time to think. Grandpa had basically left me the blueprints to something that had never been built, something that might not even work. But he'd also left me something more important. The feeling that maybe I was capable of more than just fixing other people's broken cars. That night, I spread everything out on my kitchen table and tried to make sense of what I was looking at. The designs were incredibly detailed, but they assumed a level of mechanical knowledge that I wasn't sure I possessed. I could rebuild a transmission with my eyes closed. But this was different. This was art disguised as engineering. I knew I needed help. And there was only one person I could think of who might understand what Grandpa had been trying to create. Tom Bradley had been Grandpa's best friend since they served together in Vietnam. After the war, Tom had opened a little repair shop that specialized in vintage electronics, old radios, record players, anything with tubes and analog guts that most people had given up on. His place was about 20 minutes outside of town, tucked behind a grove of oak trees that made it look like something from a Norman Rockwell painting. The garage was cluttered with the corpses of 1,000 electronic devices, all waiting for Tom to breathe life back into them. Tom was in his 70s now, but his hands were still steady, and his mind was sharp as ever. When I knocked on his workshop door, he looked up from a 1940s Philco radio he was rebuilding and grinned like he was genuinely happy to see me. Charlie Miller, he said, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been wiped sometime during the Reagan administration. Heard about your dad. Sorry for your lost son. I thanked him and got straight to the point. Tom had known Grandpa better than anyone, and if these blueprints were going to make sense to anybody, it would be him. When I unrolled the first set of plans on his workbench, Tom's expression changed completely. He put on his reading glasses and studied the drawings like he was looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, I'll be damned, he whispered after a few minutes. Joe actually drew these up properly. I always thought he was just dreaming out loud when he talked about this thing. Tom explained that Grandpa had mentioned the Music Machine project dozens of times over the years, but he'd never seen the actual plans. According to Tom, Grandpa believed that modern music had lost something important. The craftsmanship, the attention to detail, the sense that each song was a handmade work of art. Your grandfather thought he was Elvis with a wrench. Tom chuckled, running his fingers along the blueprint lines. But hell, maybe he was onto something. This design is actually brilliant. Tom walked me through the mechanics of how the machine would work. It was part old-school jukebox, part premium record player, and part something entirely new. Instead of just dropping a coin and pressing a button, this would be a handcrafted musical experience that treated vinyl records like the art they were meant to be. It's not just playing back a recording, Tom explained, his voice getting more excited with each word. It's creating a whole atmosphere around the music. The way the record drops, the ritual of selection, the warm analog sound, like having a piece of musical history in a wooden box. But what really got Tom fired up was the craftsmanship aspect. Everything about the design emphasized handmade quality. Solid wood construction, brass fittings, mechanisms that were meant to last for generations rather than years. This isn't just a machine, Charlie, Tom said, holding up one of the more detailed drawings. This is time in a box. This is your grandfather's way of saying that some things are worth doing the slow way, the right way. We spent the next 3 hours going through every page of the journal, with Tom explaining the more complex mechanical concepts, and me trying to absorb 30 years of engineering genius in one evening. By the time we finished, my head was spinning with possibilities. What once looked like impossible complexity now felt like a series of puzzles, each one solvable one step at a time. So I finally asked, do you think it would actually work? Could someone actually build one of these things? Tom leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out what kind of man I was underneath all the doubt and disappointment. Charlie, he said slowly, if we build this machine, you won't just be bringing your grandfather's dream to life. You'll be bringing him back to life. Those words hit me like lightning. For the first time in years, I felt like I finally belonged somewhere. Tom offered to help me figure out the technical challenges, and I promised to come back the next day with more questions and a lot more enthusiasm. As I loaded the blueprints back into my truck, Tom called out one last piece of advice. Remember, son, your grandfather didn't leave you these plans because he thought you'd get rich. He left them because he knew you'd understand what they really mean. The drive home felt different than the drive out. Instead of uncertainty, I felt purpose. Instead of wondering what I was going to do with my life, I was already planning how I was going to spend the next few months. Back in my trailer, I cleared off the kitchen table and spread out the blueprints one more time. But now, instead of seeing an impossible dream, I was starting to see the first steps of an actual plan. I stayed up until 3 a.m, reading and rereading Grandpa's journal, trying to absorb not just the technical details, but the passion behind them. He'd written about music the way other people write about religion, like it was something sacred that deserved to be treated with reverence and care. And maybe that was exactly what the world needed. Not another digital device that would be obsolete in 2 years, but something built to last, something that honored the music and the people who made it. As I finally closed the journal and headed to bed, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice whispering in the darkness. Sometimes the best gifts come wrapped in sawdust and possibility, Charlie, but you've got to have the courage to unwrap them. For the first time in my life, I felt like I might actually have that courage. Building something with your hands changes you. I never understood that until I started working on Grandpa's music machine in Tom's cluttered garage, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 broken radios and the smell of old wood and WD-40. Tom's workshop became my second home over the next 6 weeks. Every morning, I drive over with a thermos of coffee and a head full of questions. Every evening, I drive home with sawdust in my hair and the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we were creating something magical. The first challenge was the wood. Grandpa's blueprints called for solid cherry, aged at least 10 years, with specific grain patterns that would resonate properly with the internal mechanisms. Tom knew a guy who had a barn full of reclaimed lumber from a church that got torn down in the 80s. We spent an entire Saturday driving out to this farm in the middle of nowhere, where an old-timer named Frank had stacks of beautiful cherry boards just waiting for the right project. When we told him what we were building, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. Music machine, eh? Frank said, running his weather hands along the wood grain. My daddy built fiddles back in the day. Always said the wood chooses the music, not the other way around. We came home with enough cherry to build 3 machines, plus some walnut Frank threw in for free, because he liked the idea of old wood getting a new purpose. Loading all that lumber into my truck felt like loading up dreams. The mechanical parts were trickier. We needed precision springs, brass fittings, and a tone arm assembly that didn't exist anymore. Tom had contacts in the vintage audio world. Guys who restored old Wurlitzer jukeboxes and Hammond organs for collectors who had more money than sense. It took 3 weeks of phone calls and favor trading, but eventually we had everything we needed. Some parts came from a jukebox graveyard in Detroit. Others we had to machine ourselves on Tom's ancient lathe that probably dated back to the Eisenhower administration. Building the cabinet was like having a conversation with Grandpa across the decades. Every measurement, every joint, every carefully routed channel for the wiring felt like following instructions he'd left specifically for me. Tom would watch me work and occasionally nod his approval, like he could see the old man's hands guiding mine. The design was elegant in its simplicity. A wooden box about the size of a dorm room refrigerator, with a curved front that reminded me of those classic cars from the 50s. The record selection mechanism was visible through a glass panel, so you could watch the magic happen. But the real magic was in the details. Brass corners that caught the light just right. A leather-wrapped handle that felt perfect in your hand. Vacuum tubes that glowed warm amber when the machine was running, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. Your grandfather understood something most people don't. Tom said one evening as we installed the tone arm assembly, he knew that people don't just want to hear music. They want to experience it. The moment of truth came on a Tuesday in November. We'd been working on this thing for 6 weeks, and it was finally time to see if all those blueprints and calculations actually added up to something that worked. Tom had found a pristine copy of Wichita Lineman by Glenn Campbell, the same song Grandpa used to hum while he worked on radios. We slid it into the machine, selected track 1, and held our breath. What happened next still gives me goosebumps. The machine didn't just play the song, it performed it. The record dropped onto the turntable with a satisfying mechanical click. The tone arm moved into position with ballet-like precision, and then Glenn Campbell's voice filled the garage with a warmth and clarity that made my cheap stereo sound like a tin can. But it was more than just the sound. It was the ritual, the anticipation, the way the whole machine seemed to come alive with purpose. This wasn't just playing music. This was celebrating it. I started crying right there in Tom's garage. Couldn't help it. Hearing that song, watching this machine that had lived in Grandpa's imagination for 40 years finally do what it was designed to do, it felt like he was right there with us, grinning and probably making some joke about how it only took us 6 weeks to figure out what he'd been trying to tell us all along. Tom just patted my shoulder and let me have my moment. He understood. This wasn't just about building a machine. It was about keeping promises that had been waiting decades to be fulfilled. Wichita Lineman had been Grandpa's favorite song. He used to sing it on the front porch of our old house, usually after a few beers and a long day in the garage. Said it reminded him that even the loneliest job in the world could be beautiful if you did it with purpose. Standing there listening to it play on our machine, I finally understood what he meant. We'd built something that didn't just make music. We'd built something that made memories. Tom's daughter Jenny stopped by that weekend to drop off some groceries for her old man. She's one of those 20-something kids who always has her phone out, documenting everything for social media. When she saw our music machine, she got that look that young people get when they see something that's both old and cool at the same time. She asked if she could film it playing a song, and Tom shrugged like it was no big deal. Jenny picked out a Patsy Cline record from Tom's collection, hit record on her phone, and captured the whole ritual, the selection, the mechanical ballet, the gorgeous sound filling the room. 3 days later, Tom called me in a panic. Jenny's video had gone completely viral on TikTok, 1.5 million views and climbing. The comments section was exploding with people sharing their own memories of their fathers and grandfathers, stories about music and craftsmanship, and the way things used to be made. "This is my dad in the garage in the 80s, one person wrote. "How much does this cost?" "I need one for my bar," posted another. "Finally, something that treats music like art instead of data," said a third. My phone started ringing. First, it was local coffee shops and restaurants who'd seen the video and wanted to know if they could buy one. Then it was people from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, places where people still remember what it felt like to really listen to music. The first official order came from a place called the Vinyl Vault in Chicago. The owner said his customers were tired of digital playlists and wanted something that made music feel special again. He offered $5,000 for one machine, delivery in 6 weeks. $5,000. I'd never seen that much money for something I'd built with my own hands. But more than the money, it was a validation that maybe Grandpa had been right all along. Maybe there really was a place in this world for things that were made slowly, carefully, with respect for both the craft and the customer. Tom and I looked at each other across his workbench and realized we had a decision to make. We could build one machine for the guy in Chicago and call it a day, or we could try to turn this into something bigger. The problem was space. Tom's garage was perfect for building one machine, but if we were going to fill orders from multiple cities, we needed room to work. More importantly, we needed help. 2 guys in their 70s and 20s weren't going to be able to keep up with demand. That's when Tom suggested we talk to some of the local guys who'd been hitting retirement age and going a little stir-crazy. Veterans mostly, and skilled tradesmen who'd spent their careers building things that mattered and weren't quite ready to spend their golden years watching cable TV. Bill Henderson had been a carpenter for 40 years before his back gave out. Henry Walsh used to run a machine shop before automation put him out of business. Lee Kowalski was an Army mechanic who'd come home from Desert Storm and spent 30 years fixing trucks for the county. All 3 of them were bored out of their minds and looking for something to do with their hands. When we showed them the blueprints and the machine we'd built, their eyes lit up like kids on Christmas morning. "I thought retirement was supposed to be about fishing and drinking beer," Bill grumbled while examining our joinery work. "Not building your Woodstock in a box. But hell, this beats watching the Weather Channel." Henry was fascinated by the precision required for the mechanical components. Lee kept asking technical questions about the electronics. By the end of the afternoon, we had a team. The next challenge was finding a place to work. Tom's garage was great for prototyping, but we needed real workshop space if we were going to build multiple machines at once. Tom knew about an old airplane hangar on the outskirts of town that had been sitting empty since the small airport closed in the 90s. The owner was a guy named Pete who'd been trying to rent it for years with no luck. When Tom explained what we wanted to do, Pete offered us a deal that seemed too good to be true. 6 months free rent in exchange for fixing up the building and making it functional again. Walking into that hangar for the first time felt like stepping into a cathedral. High ceilings, natural light streaming through dusty windows. Enough space to build 100 music machines if we wanted to. The concrete floor was cracked and there were birds nesting in the rafters, but underneath all the neglect, you could see the bones of something special. We spent 2 weeks cleaning and organizing, setting up workbenches and organizing tools. Bill built us a proper lumber rack. Henry installed better lighting. Lee wired up the electrical system and got the heat working. By the time we were ready to start production, it felt like more than just a workshop. It felt like a mission. We decided to call ourselves Heritage Sound Company, with a tagline that Henry suggested, "Music that remembers you." The idea was simple. We weren't just building music machines. We were building instruments of memory. Every one would be handcrafted, unique, designed to last for generations rather than years. Our first official order from the Chicago bar was due in 3 weeks. We had 4 guys, 1 proven design, and enough enthusiasm to power a small city. What we didn't have was any idea how much this thing was going to change our lives. The morning we fired up the tools and started cutting wood for our first production run, I caught myself thinking about something Grandpa had written in his journal. Music is the bridge between what was and what will be. Standing in that hangar, watching Bill measure twice and cut once while Henry calibrated the lathe and Lee tested circuit boards, I realized we weren't just building machines. We were building the future that Grandpa had dreamed about, a future where craftsmanship mattered, where music was treated with respect, where old guys like us could still make something beautiful with our hands. The first machine for Chicago was going to be perfect, but more than that, it was going to be the first note in a song that I had a feeling was just getting started. 3 weeks later, we loaded our first Heritage Sound music machine into my truck for the drive to Chicago. It was wrapped in blankets like a newborn baby, secured with enough straps to hold down a small airplane. Tom rode shotgun, and we both felt like we were delivering more than just a custom jukebox. We were delivering a promise that had been 40 years in the making. The vinyl vault was everything I'd hoped it would be, dimly lit, lined with thousands of records, filled with people who looked like they actually listened to music instead of just hearing it. When we uncrated our machine and plugged it in, a small crowd gathered around like we were performing some kind of sacred ritual. The owner, a guy named Marcus who had the kind of beard that suggested he took his vinyl seriously, selected a Stevie Ray Vaughan record and let our machine do its thing. When those first guitar notes filled the room, the whole crowd went quiet. Then something amazing happened. People started smiling. Not the polite smile you give when someone shows you something they're proud of, but the real smile that comes from witnessing something genuinely special. "Charlie," Marcus said, shaking my hand like I just given him the keys to a time machine, "people are going to dance to this thing like it's 1965. You've created something that brings music back to life." On the drive home, Tom and I didn't talk much. We were both thinking the same thing. This was just the beginning. Word was going to spread. More orders were going to come. And somewhere out there, Grandpa was probably laughing his ass off at how long it took us to figure out what he'd known all along. Some things are worth the wait. Some dreams are worth building twice. And sometimes, the best way to honor the past is to give it a future. Back in the hangar, Bill, Henry, and Lee were already working on machine number 2. The sound of hand tools and classic rock filled the air, and I realized that this wasn't just a business anymore. This was home. The first year of Heritage Sound Company went by like a song you never want to end. What started as 4 guys in an old airplane hangar turned into something none of us had expected, a business that actually mattered to people. By month 3, we had a waiting list. By month 6, we'd hired 2 more craftsmen, Jimmy, a retired Navy mechanic who specialized in electronics, and Frank, the lumber guy who decided he'd rather help build music machines than just sell wood. By month 12, we produced over 200 machines, each one handcrafted and unique. The numbers still blow my mind when I think about them. We were charging between $20,000 and $25,000 per machine, depending on the wood, the electronics package, and the custom features. That might sound like crazy money for what's basically a fancy jukebox, but our customers understood what they were buying. They weren't just purchasing a machine that played records. They were investing in a piece of functional art that would outlast them, their kids, and probably their grandkids too. Our customer base was unlike anything I'd ever imagined. High-end restaurants in New York wanted them as conversation pieces. Craft breweries in Portland ordered them to match their artisanal aesthetic. Private collectors in California bought them for home listening rooms that cost more than most people's houses. But the orders that meant the most to me came from places like the VFW Post in Toledo or the small-town diner in Indiana, where 3 generations of the same family had been serving coffee and playing the same scratched-up records for 40 years. Word travels fast in the music world, especially when you're doing something that nobody else is doing. By winter, journalists started calling. First it was a local paper, then some trade magazines, then the big guys. Rolling Stone sent a photographer who spent 2 days documenting our process. The writer asked me if I'd sold my soul to make these machines. I told him I hadn't sold anything. I just borrowed my grandfather's soul for a while. NPR did a piece about the revival of handcrafted audio equipment. Vintage Guitar magazine put us on their cover with the headline, "The New Vintage Revolution." Suddenly, we weren't just building music machines. We were part of some kind of cultural movement. The attention was flattering, but it was also overwhelming. People started treating me like I was some kind of visionary instead of just a guy who'd found his grandfather's blueprints and decided to follow them. The money changed everything, but not in the ways you might expect. By the end of our first year, Heritage Sound Company had grossed over $4 million. After expenses, payroll, and taxes, my share was enough to make me officially wealthy for the first time in my life. But wealth isn't just about the numbers in your bank account. Real wealth is being able to wake up every morning knowing that what you're doing matters, that you're building something that will outlast you. Of course, success brings its own set of problems. My brother Jake, who hadn't spoken to me since we were reading, suddenly started texting. First, it was casual messages asking how I was doing. Then he started hinting that maybe there was room for him in the business. Finally, he just came out and asked, "Maybe you could give me a chance? I could handle sales or marketing or something." I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to walk to the post office. Then I mailed him a Johnny Cash record, Ring of Fire, with a note tucked inside. "Listen with your heart, not your wallet." He never responded. Some bridges are meant to be rebuilt, and some people only show up when there's money involved. Sarah, my sister, was different. She called to congratulate me and never once asked for anything. Said she was proud that someone in the family had turned Dad's stubbornness into something positive. That meant more to me than all the magazine articles combined. The success also brought opportunities I'd never dreamed of. Music equipment companies wanted to license our designs. Investors offered to buy us out for amounts that would have set us all up for life. But every time someone made an offer, I'd think about what Grandpa had written in his journal about the difference between building something and just owning something. We weren't in this business to get rich quick and bail out. We were in it to prove that there was still room in the world for things made the right way. Tom and I made a pact early on. Heritage Sound Company would never go public, never franchise, never compromise on quality for the sake of growth. We'd rather build 50 perfect machines a year than 500 mediocre ones. With my share of the profits, I did something I'd been dreaming about since I was a kid living in that trailer. I bought a house. Not just any house. A farmhouse in Wisconsin that sat on 20 acres overlooking Lake Michigan. The property had been on the market for 2 years because it needed work and was too far from the city for most buyers. But the moment I saw it, I knew it was meant to be mine. The house was everything I'd imagined when I was younger. Wraparound porch, original hardwood floors, a kitchen big enough for a family, and enough land to see the horizon. The previous owners had been farmers who'd raised 5 kids there before retiring to Florida. But what really sold me was the barn. It was the perfect size for a workshop, and from the windows, you would see all the way to the lake where Grandpa used to take me camping when I was little. Moving day was bittersweet. The trailer that had been my home for 6 years was coming with me, but not as my residence anymore. I had it towed to Wisconsin and set up behind the farmhouse like a monument to where I'd come from. Some people thought it was weird, keeping that old tin when I could afford to live in a mansion, but that trailer represented something important. Proof that you don't have to forget where you started just because you end up somewhere better. The first night in the new house, I put on a Johnny Cash record and walked through those empty rooms, imagining how they'd look once I filled them with furniture and memories. Standing in what would become my living room, I could almost see Grandpa sitting in his old recliner, nodding his approval. "You did good, kid," I whispered to the empty house. "You'd be proud of what we built." Success in business is one thing, but success in life is something else entirely. The money was nice, but what really changed my life was meeting Emma. She was the daughter of Marcus, the guy who owned the vinyl vault in Chicago, where we'd sold our first machine. Emma had just finished her master's degree in music therapy and was helping her dad run the store while she figured out her next move. The first time I saw her, she was kneeling on the floor of the record shop, carefully organizing a collection of Blue Note jazz albums that someone had donated. She handled each record like it was made of glass, reading the liner notes and occasionally smiling at something she found interesting. When she stood up and introduced herself, I forgot how to speak like a normal human being. She had this way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying was the most important thing in the world. We started talking about music. then about craftsmanship, then about the difference between making things that last and making things that sell. She understood immediately why our machines mattered, why people were willing to pay serious money for something they could get cheaper elsewhere. "It's not about the music," she said, running her fingers along the wood grain of our latest machine. "It's about the ritual. It's about taking time to really experience something instead of just consuming it." Emma started making trips to Ohio to see our workshop and learn about our process. What began as professional curiosity turned into something more personal when she'd bring coffee from her favorite Chicago roaster and spend hours asking thoughtful questions about our craft. She understood things about music and emotion that I'd never considered, and she helped me see our machines from a completely different perspective. 6 months later, I asked her to marry me in the same record shop where we'd met. She said yes, while At Last by Etta James played in the background on one of our machines. The wedding was small, just family and the guys from the workshop. I'd invited both Jake and Sarah, but only Sarah made the trip from Columbus with her husband and the twins. Jake never even responded to the invitation, which honestly didn't surprise me. We held it on the porch of the farmhouse, with Lake Michigan stretching out behind us like a promise of good things to come. Tom officiated because he'd gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. During the ceremony, I looked out at our small group of friends and realized that wealth isn't about money at all. It's about being surrounded by people who understand what you're trying to build and want to help you build it. Emma moved to Wisconsin and brought a warmth to the farmhouse that I hadn't realized was missing. She converted one of the bedrooms into a music room, lined with shelves for records and equipped with a high-end stereo system that made our already impressive machine sound even better. But more than that, she brought perspective. She helped me understand that Heritage Sound Company wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about creating space for the future to be better than what came before. 2 years after we got married, Emma told me she was pregnant. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset over the lake, and she handed me a tiny Johnny Cash onesie she'd found at a vintage shop in Milwaukee. "I thought our little one should be dressed appropriately for their first Heritage Sound experience," she said with that smile that still made my heart skip. Our son was born on a Tuesday in March during the worst blizzard Wisconsin had seen in 20 years. The roads were so bad that we almost didn't make it to the hospital. But little Joe Miller decided he was ready whether the weather cooperated or not. Yes, we named him after Grandpa, Emma's idea and the perfect choice. Watching your kid grow up changes how you see everything. When Joe was old enough to sit up on his own, I'd hold him on my lap. While I worked on machines in the home workshop I'd set up in the barn. He'd watch the gears turn and the tone arms move with the same fascination I'd felt as a kid watching Grandpa fix radios. By the time he was 3, he could identify different types of wood by smell. By 5, he knew the names of all the tools and could explain how a turntable worked. By 7, he was asking questions that made me think about our machines in completely new ways. "Dad," he asked one evening while we were working on a particularly complex custom order, "why do the old songs sound better than the new ones?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because they're real, Joe, just like me and you." That's when I started doing something I'd learned from Grandpa, hiding little notes and letters for Joe to find later, tucked into books, slipped behind picture frames, folded up inside record sleeves. Nothing dramatic, just reminders that he was loved and thoughts about life that might make sense to him when he was older. Emma thought it was sweet. Joe thought it was a game. I thought it was the most important thing I could do as a father, leave a trail of breadcrumbs that would help my son find his way home to himself someday. Heritage Sound Company kept growing, but we were careful about how we grew. We hired more craftsmen, but only guys who understood what we were trying to do. We expanded the workshop, but we never compromised on quality or rushed our process. By Joe's 7th birthday, we were producing about 300 machines a year and had a waiting list that stretched 18 months. We could have scaled up faster, hired more people, built more machines. But that would have meant changing what made us special in the first place. The business gave us financial security, but more than that, it gave us purpose. Emma started a program that donated music machines to veterans' hospitals and senior centers. Tom began teaching woodworking classes for local high school kids who wanted to learn traditional crafts. Bill, Henry, and Lee became like family. They'd come over for Sunday dinners and argue about baseball, while Joe climbed all of them like they were his favorite uncles, which, in a way, they were. One evening, when Joe was 7, we were sitting on the porch listening to one of our machines play Johnny Cash's version of Hurt. It was the same song that had been playing the night Grandpa died, but somehow it sounded different now. Less like an ending and more like a conversation between past and future. Joe was playing with our dog, a golden retriever named Vinyl, who'd wandered onto our property as a puppy and decided to stay. Emma was reading a book about child development. I was just watching and listening and feeling grateful for the life we'd built together. "Dad," Joe said, looking up from where he was throwing a tennis ball for Vinyl, "are you old like these records?" I laughed. "Old, but still spinning, kiddo." Later that night, after Joe was asleep and Emma had gone to bed, I sat in Grandpa's old recliner, the one I'd rescued from the trailer before moving to Wisconsin, and thought about how far we'd all come. The scared 24-year-old who'd opened a cardboard box full of vinyl records felt like a different person. That guy had been worried about belonging somewhere, about building something that mattered, about living up to promises that other people had made and broken. Now I understood what Grandpa had been trying to tell me all along. Success isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you create. Wealth isn't about what you own. It's about what you give away. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about making sure the people you love have everything they need to write their own stories. I'd built a business that employed good people doing meaningful work. I'd found a partner who understood my dreams and helped me dream bigger ones. I'd raised a son who knew how to use his hands and his heart in equal measure. But most importantly, I'd kept faith with a promise that had been waiting 30 years to be fulfilled. Every machine we built was a letter from the past to the future, a reminder that some things are worth doing slowly, carefully, with love. The kid who'd gotten nothing but a cardboard box had turned that nothing into everything that mattered. And somewhere out there, in workshops and record stores and living rooms around the world, our machines were playing the soundtrack to other people's most important moments. As I finally headed to bed that night, I could hear Joe talking to himself in his room, probably explaining something complicated to his stuffed animals the way kids do. Emma was already asleep, curled up with a book about music education that she'd been reading for her work at the Veterans Hospital. The house was full of the kind of quiet that comes from being exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing, with exactly the people you're meant to love. Life is like an old song. You never know when it's going to end, but every note matters. Every measure counts. Every harmony adds something to the whole that wasn't there before. The future isn't about new gadgets or faster technology. It's about old records playing for new hearts, about traditions passed down through hands that know how to build things that last. And sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the lake is still, I swear I can hear Grandpa humming along to whatever's playing on the machine in the living room, keeping time with the rhythm of a life well lived. The music never really stops. It just finds new voices to carry the song forward.